I'm John Friedman. I'm the dean here at the Watson School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon. Today, you're joining us for one of our conversations as part of an event series marking our inaugural year, the launch of the Watson School. And as Brown's new policy school and the university's hub for research, teaching, and public engagement, we're really trying to seed these conversations on a range of the world's most pressing policy challenges. And one of the ways that we do that, one of our great privileges here, is to be able to engage with leaders who have been in the seat, who have really been at the table as some of these great challenges and decisions have worked out, and who have been part of these debates about democracy and development and sustainability around the world. And so it's really in that spirit that I'm so happy to be here today. Before introducing our distinguished guest, I just want to note a few things. So the first thing is that this talk is being recorded and live streamed, and it will be available on Watson's YouTube channel shortly after the event. The second thing is that the whole spirit of this is to foster conversation and debate on some of these important issues. And the visitors are contributing their experience and perspectives, which is a very important part of our mission here of promoting a just, peaceful, and more prosperous world. Now, over the course of this event or other events at Watson, part of having a diverse set of perspectives is you may hear something you disagree with. Maybe you hear something that you really, really disagree with, and that's okay. That's a good thing. And understanding and working through these disagreements is a critical part of making progress on these difficult policy issues. And I think we best do that. We best understand disagreement by being respectful, curious, and gracious. We are trying to be respectful of each other's differences and perspectives, curious to understand more about why those perspectives diverge, and gracious in interpreting the intent of others' comments. You may also feel the need to protest. That's okay too, but your right to protest stops at interference with everybody else's ability to engage in that conversation, even for a brief time. And so I'm really confident in the community here that we'll kind of have the capacity to learn from these conversations. And so let's really get to today's speaker. President Iván Duque Marquez was elected to the president of Colombia in 2018 at the age of 41. So just think about that. I'm 45. It really makes me wonder what I've been doing with my life. This made him the youngest elected president in the country's modern history. And, it wasn't just that he was president, but he took office at really a pivotal moment in the country's history. It was implementing a historic peace agreement with various rebel groups. It was responding to growing migration flows from neighboring Venezuela. It was in the moment of strengthening democratic institutions and positioning itself as a growing economy in a rapidly changing global economy. So during his presidency, he dealt with these challenges and more. He championed policies aimed at inclusion and stability and opportunity for all of these Venezuelan immigrants that continue to flow into the country. He led Colombia to emerge as a leader in green finance and renewable energy as part of not just economic growth, but expanded protection of many of Colombia's natural areas. For instance, launching the Concordia Amazon Initiative, convening global leaders to really coordinate around conservation efforts. He shepherded the nation through the challenges of COVID-19. And, Colombian presidents are term limited to one term of 4 years. So after leaving office in 2022, he's really continued to engage on these issues at the global stage. He launched the Iván Duque Center for Prosperity and Freedom, advancing dialogue and policy innovation to promote democratic values, economic opportunity, and sustainable development. He founded the I+D Foundation to empower young innovators from some of Colombia's most remote regions, again, reflecting that commitment to entrepreneurship and social mobility. And, through these initiatives and others, through his writings, through participation in a wide range of boards and other programs, he remains a global voice on all of these important issues. So please join me in giving a warm, brown welcome to our guest tonight, President Iván Duque Marquez. So I want to start this afternoon with, one of what seems like the largest shocks recently to Latin America and the region, which is the kind of shock removal of President Maduro in Venezuela and kind of the rapid changes that have followed. We can talk about the policy implications and all the flow out, but I just want to start, like, what did you think about when you woke up presumably that morning and read about what was happening? Like, what was going through your mind given all that you've been through in dealing with that country?
Well, first of all, Dean Friedman, it's a great honor for me to be here at Brown University. I'm happy to be here with you at the school and also to be for the first time in Providence. So I hope this is going to be one visit of many in the course of my life. And I'm so honored to be here with the faculty and the students. So let me begin by responding to your question. And I want to put something in context. For a great part of the last decade, I've been advocating for the removal of Nicolás Maduro as the dictator of Venezuela. He was not a legitimate president. He stole 3 elections in a row. He stole the election in 2018, and that's why at that time he was not recognized internationally. That's why there was an interim president in 2019. And he was also indicted by the US in 2020. An indictment that was bipartisanly supported, bicamerally supported, based on the evidence of all his criminal activities. I had the privilege and the pleasure of denouncing him to the International Criminal Court while I was a senator and later on as a head of state. So I thought the removal of Nicolás Maduro was a moral necessity. And I call him an equivalent of a Slobodan Milosevic in Latin America. So when I've heard about interventions that the US have done in the world that I consider lawful, like the killing of Osama bin Laden, or when President Clinton used his capacity to call other leaders in NATO to capture Milosevic and take him to international justice, I consider this action something that Latin America desperately needed for the regional security, but also to bring back not only stability, but a full protection of the Venezuelan people that had been brutally and systematically affected by Nicolás Maduro. So that night, the 2nd of January, and let me tell you something that was very particular. The night before, I had been in Miami with a group of Venezuelan friends, and they asked me, do you think there's going to be an invasion in Venezuela? So I said, I don't know if the word is invasion, maybe the word is precision. So on the 2nd of January, I flew to DC with my family. That night, I shut off my cell phone, which is something that I don't regularly do. And I woke up around 3 a.m. and I turn on my phone and I see all these messages coming, and Nicolás Maduro was captured and taken to the U.S. justice. So that day, I celebrated for the Venezuelan people. However, the tyrant is no longer there, but the tyranny is still there. And I just look forward that there is a state policy and not just a government policy, so that the 3 items that have been described by Secretary Rubio, which is the stabilization, recovery, and transition that can overlap, happen quicker and with the possibility of building a bipartisan and bicameral consensus, because the success of this is not just the success of an administration here in the US. The success of this is a success in the Western Hemisphere, and this requires to think bold, think big, and have a very meticulous institutional coordination. So I am happy, but still, I think we need to see what the end game is. And I think that's what will determine the success of this that occurred earlier this year.
And so, the perspective that you offer, right? It's, at some level, it seems like, I've seen polls suggesting that, even within Venezuela itself, this was like a very popular action. Yes. How do we balance the instrumental outcome of removing somebody who was a very bad guy with what might be a difficult precedent that whenever the American president decides he or she does not like someone, they can kind of just go remove them.
Well, I think
how do we balance those two things?
Well, the first thing, Dean Friedman, is that this is not something that just came out of the president's leave in night of early January 2026. The U.S. has been consistently bipartisan and bicameral requesting a change of regime in Venezuela, and especially for the last 8 years. There's been a consistent voice. And many things were tried. During the Trump first administration, when I was in office, we worked with what was called a diplomatic blockade. When we recognized Juan Guaidó, when we created the Lima Group, we used all the diplomatic tools in our hands to put pressure on the regime. Later, President Biden came to power, and he also used sanctions, and he put a lot of pressure on Maduro. And we all did in Latin America, with few exceptions, but also the European Union did the same thing. But it was clear for me, after we have tried everything, that the only thing that would really make a change was a humanitarian intervention. And I used that term at the end of 2024 in an interview because people say military intervention. I said humanitarian intervention. The intervention when Slobodan Milosevic was captured, yes, it was a military intervention, but the trigger was a humanitarian intervention to put an end to a genocide. Well, Nicolás Maduro has killed thousands of people, captured and tortured thousands of people that think differently, and that is also a genocide. So the action was legitimate. And I think this was the last resort tool, which also happened after many months of direct negotiation. The current USA administration had conversation with Nicolás Maduro for almost a year. They offered asylum. They offered a third state. They offered multiple things. And Nicolás Maduro was playing games constantly, winning time and trying to push forward any credible action from his side. And I think that was the reason why the precision operation occurred. Militarily speaking, it was flawless. It was a perfect operation. Now, politically, I think we're still under great expectations on how this is going to end. Because Delcy Rodriguez and her brother know that as the U.S. gets closer to the midterm elections, the interest and maybe the spotlight of Venezuela is going to start falling in intensity. And they have done that various times. So that's why I say that the success of this will be determined on how those three elements of a stabilization, recovery, and transition happen in the course of this year. And if you were to ask me, yes, the perfect is enemy of the good. But the best outcome for this year is that 2026 should end with at least a new call for free and fair elections in Venezuela, and also a re-engineering of the Venezuelan army. People don't regularly know this, but there are 3,000 generals in Venezuela. The U.S. has less than 400 generals. And the reason why they have 3,000 generals is because it was a way of decentralizing power so that each general can have a chunk of the criminal activity that surrounds the Venezuelan dark economy. And if that doesn't change, it's going to be very difficult for this to succeed. So the call for elections and the transformation of the Venezuelan army are imminent, pivotal, and urgent. And that will determine the success.
So let me now turn to an aspect of this crisis that played out in Colombia when you were president. Right, there are millions of refugees forced from Venezuela, both through direct persecution and also because as the economy fell apart. And what I think really stands out in the experience of Colombia is the way in which not only the refugees were welcomed initially, but the set of policies that were implemented in a way that has maintained the support for those refugees over a longer period of time, and really seems to be, I would say, one of the best cases in the world for refugees and immigrants more generally, kind of really leading to the strengthening of societies. And so I'm just interested. Let's start with tell people some of what you did as part of dealing with that. It was a crisis, I think, and why you think that landed in a different place than in so many other countries around the world that are dealing with similar issues.
So this answer might take a little bit longer than I could have do it, but I think there were presidents in my life that allowed me to think on a broad policy perspective, but also in a more humanitarian perspective. I had an uncle who was my grandmother's brother, and in the times of very deep violence in Colombia in the late 1950s, he moved to Venezuela. That was my Uncle Toño, and he lived in Venezuela until very early in the Chavez era that he came back to Colombia. But I had the privilege of visiting him a couple of times with my mother, and I understood when he spoke about Venezuela as the country that opened their arms to allow him to find an opportunity in life. And that's something that I will never forget. And then, when I came to the United States to live here in the early 2000s, I remember that I met a group of Central American citizens that had been provided with a temporary protection status, the TPS, right after Hurricane Mitch. And they were able to build a future. And I understood that when you're an immigrant and you have the opportunity to blend into a society, and things that are simple like opening a bank account, entering to the social security system, being able to find a formal job, you're really entering into a formal existence as a foreigner. But also studying this country. And I remember that I read a book written by President Kennedy while he was in office that was called A Nation of Immigrants. This country has been shaped in its history by the massive contribution of immigrants. So that also was in my head. When I run for the presidency and I was looking at what was happening with the huge influx of Venezuelans to Colombia, and I made a debate in Congress telling the previous administration before my government was, be careful because this is going to be massive. And by the time I was sworn in, we already had almost 3 million Venezuelans, and I had promised in the campaign that I will advocate for a temporary protection status. But things cannot happen overnight. You need to do the policy planning, you need to get all the analysis, and you have to make a decision. So I tried to call other Latin American leaders because I thought the best way is that everybody puts a TPS and then we can define a good distribution of migration so that the weight in our societies at least is manageable from a fiscal standpoint and a social standpoint. But none of the presidents were eager to do it because it was highly politically sensible. And that's how I met Professor Danny Bahar. Danny Bahar was a professor here at Brown. Danny had done some studies on migration, and I remember that I called him to come to the presidential office, and we saw the evidence, and I asked 3 questions. I said, Danny, everybody says that if I adopt a TPS, we're going to have multidimensional poverty skyrocket, informality levels to skyrocket, and unemployment levels to skyrocket. And he showed me his data. Obviously, we had done some government research, but I found it so precise and convincing that I said, I'm going to move forward. But what happened was the pandemic started. So in 2020, we did all the planning. And by the early 2021, I said, we're going for it. And we launched a TPS to allow almost 3 million Venezuelans to have the same rights as Colombian for 10 years, with the exception of political rights. And unemployment went down, multidimensional poverty went down, and informality went down. And it was very important because we allow them to blend in our society, not being declared refugees and have all these ghettos inside the country. We really want this to be a brotherhood. And the beauty of this is, and I'll have to tell you this because this is part of diplomacy and work, I called my team and I said, okay, we're going for this. And many people said, you're going to lose any political capital, Mr. President. I don't care. If this is the only reason why I was supposed to be president, I'll do it. But this is the right thing to do. But also I need to manage the communication. And I remember that I said to my team, I need to talk with the Vatican. And then many people said, why do you want to, mix this with religious stuff? And I said, no. I want to deal with the government that has more ambassadors in Colombia. There's a priest in every single town in Colombia, and I need them to help me with the pedagogy. So I remember that I called the Archbishop of Bogota and the Vatican representative, and I told them, I need you to call Pope Francis and tell him that we're implementing Fratelli Tutti, that was his encyclical about migration. So they said, well, that's a little bit above our payroll, but we'll try to see how we make it happen. The beauty of this is that on Sunday, in the St. Petersburg Plaza, Pope Francis came out and said that he applauded the Colombian authorities and the Colombian people for adopting the TPS and not being a rich country. You know what the beauty was just of that statement is that any xenophobic sentiment from any public official was killed that morning. And that's exactly what I wanted, that we'll focus on the policy and not allow xenophobia or indifference capture the spirit of the public dialogue. And that's how that TPS that's still there has made Colombia being recognized as a legitimate example of migration management. And let me tell you something. Professor Dani Bahar is working on a paper. He has worked on a paper that demonstrates that 80% of the Venezuelans that are in Colombia want to remain in Colombia. So if there's any worry about the U.S. having a massive influx of migrants in the southern border of the United States, decisions like the one we made were more effective than any other kind of repressive policy. If you have fraternity in countries like ours, we will also protect the massive influx of illegal migration to the United States.
So another one of the policy challenges you were dealing with was the implementation of the peace accord signed a few years before your administration started. And at some level, this is another, in some ways, similar challenge where you're trying to strike that balance of getting people included in society, included in the economy in a way that kind of leads to broader gains together as opposed to falling apart. But with the various insurgent groups, like there's this additional dimension of violence and connection with organized crime, and to talk us through how you thought about that balance when you were in office and kind of how you proceeded.
In 2016, I was one of the advocates for the no vote in the plebiscite. And the reason I cheered for the no vote was because my worry with impunity. That was essentially my biggest worry. But at that time, we were forced to vote a yes or a no for the whole thing. So it was take it all, leave it all. So there was not a possibility to have nuances on the agreement, because I certainly believe the agreement had things and has things that were positive. very positive. My worry was on impunity, especially for the kingpins of FARC. So we won the election. The no vote won the election, and then still was approved by Congress, and it basically took everything and include everything in the Colombian overall legislation. So then when I run for the presidency and said that I was going to amend those things that I thought were not contributing to have real justice in Colombia. When I took office, the process had been in implementation mode, quote unquote, for 18 months. And I remember that there were things that I did immediately. One was to appoint a presidential envoy that would report directly to me to be leading the whole institutional coordination for the implementation. And I appointed Emilio Archila. Emilio Archila is a great lawyer, and he has a robotic mindset. So this is a guy who gets things done. If you fall into Emilio Archila's to-do list, you better run, because he gets everything that is in the to-do list executed in a very professional way. But Emilio Archila had voted for the yes vote. So he said, Mr. President, but you're appointing me for this job, but I voted yes. And I said, well, yes, that's the reason why I'm appointing you, because I also want to give the message that I'm not here to ideologize all my convictions and try to turn all my convictions into public policy, but I'm here to understand that the president is a symbol of unity, and I need someone who has a clear belief in the implementation of the agreement. So we put everything together, and in the process of 3 years and a half, we basically passed from 5 to 7% implementation to a 33%, including the pandemic. And the Kroc Institute, that was the technical organization to follow up on the implementation, rewarded Colombia by saying, okay, you're on track. The UN had a special envoy, and we had the Secretary General coming to Colombia in 2020 to celebrate the implementation of the agreement. Actually, it was in 2021, the first 5 years. And Secretary General Guterres basically said, Colombia is an example. But there was a political cost for me inside all of this, because many people from maybe the most extreme right side of my party, they wanted me to knock out the whole thing. And I was not in a mode or in a conviction to do that. And the people from the left just wanted to say that I was not implementing because it would be unbelievable that I was advancing in the implementation. But I think the evidence, which is why we're here also in a university, which is to evaluate also evidence when we use evidence for discussions, the evidence proved that we did a lot on those fronts. And we passed amendments. We passed a constitutional amendment so that neither narco-trafficking nor kidnapping will be ever considered connects crimes with political crimes, though they will never be granted with amnesty. And still there. So we did a lot on the implementation. And I think it's sad to say that in the last 4 years, set by the UN, including the observation mission, the institutional framework has been destroyed. The coordination efforts no longer exist. And whoever comes next is going to either define whether they put all the pieces together again as they were in 2022, or they also keep on destroying this, which will be sad. I know this is not politically rewarding for me, but I don't care, because I thought part of the symbol of the presidency of unity was to implement those things that were beneficial for the country and try to introduce the reforms that the country also needed. And last but not least, the most important piece of the agreement and the most important piece of peace building is to have the regional focused development plans being effectively implemented in the regions. When I assumed office, there were only 2. We left it with 16, and with the largest distribution of social budget in those areas that were historically affected by guerrillas, paramilitaries, and narco-trafficking.
So, you mentioned how the recent administration of President Petro has kind of taken a different path on the implementation of the peace accord than your administration did. And, he's much more left-wing figure than you were and, previous presidents. Colombia is one of many countries across Latin America where, it seems like there's been this, anger at the establishment, a rejection of the establishment, and sometimes that leads to presidents leaders who are more anti-establishment on the left. Sometimes it leads to presidents who are doing a similar thing on the right. And it's certainly not limited to Latin America either. I'm wondering, again, you were not going to run for re-election in 2022, but as someone who kind of observed the political winds leading up to that, why do you think we've seen this surge in, I could call them kind of anti-establishment politicians in so many countries in recent years? What is it that has caused people to lose faith in the establishment and established political parties and kind of strike out in new ways that we're seeing?
When I look to the Colombian history and I get the term the establishment, I have to say that sometimes I'm a little doubtful because even when you look at Petro's career, Petro was mayor of Bogota, and Petro had been in Congress for 2 decades. Yes, he was a member of M19, but he stayed 20 years in Congress and then he ran for the mayorship of Bogota. So I don't think Petro in the last election was an outsider. I think the reason why he won is because he was more of an insider against Rodolfo Hernandez. And even by the time we battled politically in 2018, he tried also to call more people for the establishment to support him than even I did. I mean, and he always tried to characterize me as a son of the establishment. Yet my father was a public servant. But my father was the first person in his family to go to college. And I come from a middle-income family. And all that I received in life as the way that I could climb up the ladder professionally was through study. And yes, I did come to the United States, and I was a student in Minnesota in the 1990s, but I was a newspaper boy in my neighborhood in order for me to get some additional money for me to pay for my stay. So sometimes we fall into some characterizations that are just for the political landscape, and I think that's in the case of many things that have occurred in Colombia. And Petro tried to capitalize that message, and he was effective. But the fact is, Colombia has demonstrated that there are people that not necessarily come from the establishment that have climbed up the ladder and be presidents. Belisario Betancur was born into a very impoverished family, and Julio Cesar Turbay was the same, and Marco Fidel Suárez, and Enrique Olaya Herrera. I mean, those histories exist in Colombia. But I think he used very well the term, and he has tried to infuriate always the people against anything that is related to the entrepreneurial sector, the banking sector, the mining sector, and that's how he uses that for politics. Now, in other countries in Latin America, it's differently because, yes, there is a battle against the traditional establishment, as you have seen in Brazil with Bolsonaro, but you have also seen Milei, who has battled against the leftist establishment in Argentina, and you saw what Boric did in Chile, and now what Castro also did in Chile, because he battled against the leftist establishment. And that's the way polarized politics is flowing all over the world. Donald Trump does politics in the United States against an establishment. And you'll see in the next election, other people will do the same against the Republican establishment. That's what is happening. My worry is not that we have those transitions. I actually celebrate that in the last 28 elections in the hemisphere, the opposition has won the election with few examples. One of them, Mexico. So there is an alternance in government, which I think is very positive for democracy. My worry is more about the polarization and the less space to bridge the ideological debate, because you lose the possibility of having state policies. And I think that's where Latin America could have major setbacks. Because if we define state policies, no matter who wins or loses, and we keep technocracy and policy and politics aligned, things will work. Now, my biggest worry is that for the first time, I'm seeing a big divorce between policy and politics, and ideology is taking over the crafting of long-term policies in the benefit of our societies. And that includes also the US and Canada.
So let me zoom out for one last question. And I want to say after this, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have microphones in both aisles. If you want to, if you have a question, please come on up. We've talked a little bit now for a little while about what's been going on inside Colombia. And I'm interested in, not just that there have been many changes there, but especially with the new administration in the United States, with China becoming ever more assertive on the international stage over the past 10, 15 years, the international environment is really changing as well. And so, how would you think about that changing dynamic if you were still kind of in the seat in Bogota? How is that affecting the way that Colombia or countries like it will be engaging with the world, will be either economically or in terms of the political relations with other countries? Where do you see this going as a result of these broader changes in the world?
I think I'm a big believer in multilateralism. So I don't shy away from defending multilateralism as something that is beneficial for the world, even now in times where multilateralism is now called globalism and all these evil people that are crafting through trade agreements the destruction of society. I don't buy that crap. So I believe that multilateral order is important for world peace, to have a more constructivist approach to international relations, and to create positive levels of interdependence. What's going on today is that interdependence now, it's being weaponized. And that is dangerous, because that could destroy the whole concept of globalization and the positive of having that level of interaction. So now it's how much are you exposed in trade to the US or to China and to the rest of the world? Now matters more than any other time. I believe that Colombia, for example, needs to engage in having a stronger integration with the rest of the world. And you will ask me why? We are still a very closed economy. So the size of exports to GDP in Colombia is 16%, which ranks us in a very low place. So we need to interact more with the world and have more trade. Latin America, and this is something that you would love, intra-regional trade. Intra-regional trade in North America is above 70%. Intra-regional trade in Europe is above 45%. Intra-regional trade in Latin America is 13%. We don't trade among us. And so we have to diversify also our exports. It's very important. So if I were still in office, I would do much more to integrate with the rest of Latin America. And I also will integrate more with the world. I had a conversation last week in Panama because I showed a graph where the trade between Latin America and Europe after the free trade agreements between Latin America and Europe is not growing faster. In the contrary, it has been slower than when we had before the agreements. And why? Because China has entered Latin America, and today 95% of the Latin American and Caribbean countries have China as the number one trading partner, but with a very sad thing, and I'll use the example of Colombia. We have still the US as our number one trading partner, and we have a negative trade balance with the US in something close to 2 billion, compensated by the trade that we get on many products, but also bringing US investment to Colombia. With China, our balance is negative on $15 billion, which is almost unclosable in the near future. And that should worry us, because we are not prepared to substitute that, even if the trade wars go into something more complicated and we end up being like the sons of divorced parents in litigation, because we will have the worst of this confrontation. So I would continue to encourage to have more trade, but try to have more access of our products even to those markets. I was very respectful with China, and we had a very good relationship with China. I had a very good personal relation with Xi Jinping, but I never signed the Belt and Road Initiative just because I didn't want Colombia to be part of an umbrella that only serves China. And I said to President Xi, we're celebrating 40 years of our bilateral relationship. Let's improve our bilateral relationship and our bilateral trade, but we're not signing the Belt and Road Initiative. And I have to say something, and I don't know why the US is not capitalizing this. The most important export of this country is not the dollar. It's not technology. It's liberty, freedom, and democracy. I have never heard about the Chinese dream, nor the German dream, nor the French dream. But I have heard about the American dream. And the American dream is because you could have rich countries with authoritarian regimes, but I don't think you could have a prosperous country without liberty and freedom. And I think that's why the US needs to continue creating this kind of relationship based on those values and keep on opening the opportunities for other countries that are convinced of this system. I think weaponizing trade creates uncertainty and disbelief. And I think the US is much more powerful when it creates long-term, lasting, bipartisan and bicameral relationships like the one we have experienced for the last 200 years.